Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our LISW 21 breakfast briefing. We're really pleased that we have people joining us in the room and also people live streaming with us today. It's really nice to see the return of in-person events. When we launched our Maritime Thought Leadership Report, the Sustainability Imperative, never did we think that we would be doing that from our sort of front rooms. So we're really, really good to be able to see people get together in person. I'm not going to take up too much of your time. I'm going to hand over to Lucy, who is going to talk with our panel of guests today on the pitfalls and possibilities of the shipping technology evolution. So thanks very much, everyone.
Thank you, Lindsay. And again, let me reiterate, welcome to those of you in the room and also everyone joining us online. We're having a panel discussion today, and it should go on for around 45 minutes, we hope, which should then still allow time for questions at the end. So if you have a question, for those of you in the room, please raise your hand and perhaps wait for the microphone to find you so that everyone can take the benefit of your question. And obviously, if you're online, I think you can post a question through the chat function, and through the marvels of modern technology, it should come to me on the iPad. So if I could give a warm introduction to the panel members today, and I'll start at the end. We have Mike Phillips, a partner in our disputes resolution team here in the London office. Mike has 25 years of experience, although you would never guess, working in the maritime sector, and he's advised ship owners and traders, shipyards, financial institutions in some of their biggest disputes. He's recognised by Lloyd's List as one of the leading lawyers in the shipping industry. And Mike's broad experience includes resolving disputes that have arisen from the adoption and the development of innovative technologies. Next, we have Dan Saunders, Dan. He's also a partner in our corporate and maritime team, also based in London. And whilst his practice focuses on large-scale cross-border maritime, M&A, joint ventures and commercial contracts, he does also work on a broad range of sectors. So he will also work on sectors like technology, which is good for today's topic, agriculture and natural resources. And he also works on varying deal sizes. So we'll advise venture capital and also Series A fundraising. And last but not least, we have Mike Phillips here. We have Martin Crawford-Brunt. Sorry, Martin. He's our very special guest. He's a sought-after panelist, so we're very lucky to have him, and an advisor, an independent industry commentator. He also brings 25 years or more of experience to our panel today. Martin, he has a clear understanding of today's shipping sector landscape and the relationship between technical, regulatory, political, commercial and sustainability drivers of the key stakeholders in the maritime supply chain. As CEO of RightShip, amongst other things, he's led there the digital transformation of products and services to deliver the new data platform, algorithm, and operational safety benchmark called Safety Score to replace QI. And he continues his passion for advancing sustainability, social and safety outcomes in the maritime industry by recently founding his own business, which is called Lookout Maritime, which launched recently, and it's there to support the industry with challenging transition to a low carbon economy, whilst also adopting more sustainable business practices, whilst maintaining profitability. So welcome, Martin. Thank you. And myself, Lucy Shtenko, partner in the Structured and Asset Finance Group, again in London. Turns out I also have 25 years of experience, almost to the day, having trained at Watson Farley 25 years ago start. I specialise in shipping and offshore finance transactions, also on the lender and borrower side, and also work a lot in the cruise space as well. Quick introduction, we're living in a technological age, whether we like it or not, and in a sector perhaps historically adverse to wide-scale changes to the way things have always been done, ship operators, they're now subject to heightened pressures requiring them to embrace new technologies and advancements in technology. And these pressures, I think, are both old and new. I would say the age-old pressure of needing to operate efficiently in order to maintain profitability, but also the newer pressures that are perhaps brought on by the ever-increasing demands of and expectations of charterers, for example, or, of course, more recently, the very topical subject of decarbonisation and the energy transition. Our thought leadership publication, The Sustainability Imperative, here which we published earlier this year, it clearly shows that decarbonisation of shipping is by far the most complex and pressing area of concern for stakeholders in the shipping industry, for both ship owners and financiers alike. And as a finance lawyer, I do take a keen interest in this new technology, especially if we find we have to finance it. But today I would like to get the views of our panel members on where they think shipping is placed as a sector in adopting new technology and also in the race towards energy transition and decarbonisation. So we'll be looking a little bit also at the risks that lie ahead for stakeholders that want to adopt this technology, as well as the opportunities and positives that we can take away from it. So if I turn to the first question, I wonder perhaps if I could start with Dan and ask you, Dan, what do we mean when we talk about technology in shipping?
Yeah, it's quite a broad term there, technology, isn't it? And I think important for any discussion about risks and reward in shipping as it pertains to technology warrants a bit of a discussion about, well, what do we actually mean? And it might seem obvious, but depending on what type of technology you're talking about, the risk profile and indeed the reward profile is different. And it's just fun to talk about, isn't it? All of the different things that some of them are older technologies that are being updated and some of them are completely new ones. So you've got things like hardware for, efficiency purposes. So rotor sails, kites, sails, air cushioning systems, all really, really interesting things. And varying ways to achieve that we're seeing coming through the market. None of them are particularly new, but the way different companies are getting there is really interesting. And so that's kind of very hardware focused. At the other end of the spectrum, you've got big data technology, but that's obviously a very different risk and reward profile because you've got ship owners having to worry about things like data protection, quality of data, who owns that data. And then you've got kind of technologies in the middle. So you've got technologies like sensor technology, robotics, all of those technologies where there is a hardware component, but also a very important software component. Things like who bears the risk if the software corrupts? Who bears the risk of or the cost of installing that software? Should it be a charterer's, software and hardware? Should it be a charterer's risk? Should it be owner's risk? So I think as we talk through today, when we use the term technology, we're going to try to be a little bit more specific about, what part of the technological spectrum we're talking about, because it really, really does depend which part we're talking about as to what the particular risks and rewards we're talking about are.
Yes, it's a very broad, it can mean a lot of things when you say technology. All right, Dan. Martin, I wondered whether you had some thoughts on the distinction we should be making between innovation and optimization.
Yes, I think, as Dan said, there's a lot of complexity here, and I think this picture isn't getting any easier. So I think we have to try to make a better distinction between innovation, which is something which needs to happen in parallel to what can be done with existing assets today. So I think that it's important to recognize that there's a lot that can be done with existing ships in terms of optimization. And I think every ton of carbon that you save now is 1 ton of carbon less that you have to abate in the future. So let's not forget about the existing fleet that's being operated today and what can be done to optimize that, because there are actually a number of alternatives and options which we may get into later. And I think the innovation stream needs to happen. It needs to happen in parallel, but I think there's also an importance to be sober and understand and join up the implications of the innovation and look at that across the spectrum of things, not only from an environmental perspective, but also from a safety operational perspective as well. So I think all of these things are important.
Mm. But I think it's fair to say that there's been an uptick in activity when it comes to the development of technology in shipping, because you only have to open the shipping press to see another perhaps dual fuel new building order or a retrofit plan, or even perhaps a technological collaboration. And I've touched upon it at a high level, but what do you think are the main drivers towards this uptick? Is it ESG generally? Is it decarbonisation? What are the drivers, do you think, towards this technological advancement we're seeing particularly today?
I think people are looking for the answers. I think, people are fairly clear on the why, in terms of decarbonisation. People are fairly clear on the what in terms of, what needs to be done. But I think the how is the tough part. And so I think everyone's searching for,
and perhaps by when as well.
By when, the timescale as well, because
Yes.
I think there are different timescales depending, and it's very interesting to see that tension developing. There are different timescales depending on where you sit in the stakeholder community in terms of what those drivers are and what the imperative is to move. And I think one of the things is that we need to be a little bit careful that there isn't too large a gap between expectation and reality, because that can lead to disengagement. We need to ensure that through this process that we do bring people along. Now, that's not an excuse for doing nothing, but it means that I think we do need to be considerate of everything else that's around there. So in terms of drivers, of course, you've got, growing societal pressure. You've got growing pressure from the charterers and the cargo interests. When you think about ports and terminals as well, let's not forget about them, but they're also in this picture. And it's actually amazing to see how quickly the situation has developed. For instance, in the dry bulk industry, when I was with RightShip, watching how fast that situation developed in terms of what the cargo interests were starting to demand. What is the end customer's demand? So we have shipping and the sea transportation, but behind that, we've got a mine or a steel mill that's also looking for a decarbonisation pathway, and is also looking for partners that can support that. So I think we shouldn't keep the customer's customer out of view. In this.
I was going to say that's that consumer pressure point, really, isn't it? Where you might find that people start to vote with their feet in terms of which operators they choose to use, and even traveling down the supply chain as well, that kind of pressure that builds. Have you got anything to say about that?
Especially when you take into account the concept of GHG accounting, greenhouse gas accounting, and scope 3 kind of emissions being the type of thing where the H&Ms of the world are going to be looking up their supply chain and saying, well, look, we have to meet targets, and how are we going to do that across the whole supply chain? And if the container lines don't react to that, then it's just another disadvantage for them. So, it's a smaller part of the piece, I think, in terms of the motivation to invest here, but it is a relevant one. These GHG accounting kind of requirements aren't mandatory on everyone, but they are mandatory on London Stock Exchange listed companies. I think that's going to expand, and if it's not going to expand mandatorily, it's going to expand by choice, as you say, because customers vote with their feet sometimes, and even if the end user, the real person that's buying the product, is less motivated by that, we've seen across the spectrum of businesses, they're putting in place people who are SARs ahead of kind of emissions. You know, it is becoming a priority for businesses, just like we've seen other areas become priorities for businesses, and that's only going to increase. So you have to embrace it. And there's a big benefit, back to your original question about, you know, what's driving this. Well, there can be big benefits for first movers, you know, and for the shipping lines that are in a position to be first movers, not only on adoption of this technology, but the development of the technology. The rewards can be there. They've just got to be a bit careful, but you know, walking before they start running.
Actually, that's a good it's a good concept to think about. Is you know, in shipping, where perhaps there's a reluctance to embrace change, you know, in order to innovate and in order to decarbonise, we do need first movers. And you know, I think it's interesting perhaps to think in a little bit more detail about the hurdles to being the first mover, and what you know, if you are thinking about embracing new technology, what do you need to think about in terms of potential problems? Perhaps I could bring Mike in here.
You know, risk is the big handbrake on all of this, isn't it? Ship owner, operators, traders, they live in a world of risk, and everything they do day to day is about mitigating those risks. And adoption of new technologies represents only, in the first instance, an increase in risk. You've got increase of cost in developing an idea, deploying an idea, testing an idea, and then actually running with that idea. You've got increase for time of performance of whatever your contractual obligations are which you're serving. You've got an increase in risk around the quality of your performance. If I'm doing something in a new way, am I actually going to be able to deliver my service or product in the new way that I'm designing? So all of those are massive hurdles, and hurdles that have a long lead time to fruition, because shipping is an industry of heavy infrastructure. You spend millions, maybe billions of dollars over many months and years before you actually see the final result. What's it looking like now? And all of this development in such a complex arena like shipping is iterative. It takes place over a period of time. So it's almost axiomatic, isn't it? You read in the news, oh, such and such a company is going to construct a ship with this new technology. And then a few months later, oh, that project's a bit delayed. A few months later, oh, it's a bit more expensive than they thought. And in the worst case scenarios, of course, we see the horror story, that technology has this fundamental flaw and it can't work or needs to be adapted. And of course, that's horror story to shipping companies who naturally have, at the moment, have got a successful business that works. Don't fix it. So we're looking at those risks, the scope of that risk, which is enormous. One needs to measure, well, how are the push factors going to make people make those choices for change? And what are the pull factors? Well, the push factors are the things we've talked about, consumer stuff. Regulatory always has to play an important role. But ultimately also, there's the pull factor of increased profit by operating in a better way, increased return. That's why people are in this business in the first place. Return. Can I carry more cargo more efficiently, more quickly, and make more money? And that's really where the challenge is for the designers and innovators. And I think possibly we've got some years to go in our technological research before those solutions emerge fully. But those are my thoughts on risk anyway.
But perhaps can I move on to Dan and think about that, perhaps less from a dispute, you know, having the disputes brain, but perhaps looking at the contractual brain.
Yeah, well, so you and I deal with the risk at the other end. You know, I write the contracts, and when the dispute happens, hopefully not, you look at it. But I mean, it'd be interesting to get your thoughts on what I'm about to say, which is I think that the shipping industry kind of has a bent towards standardization. You know, we've seen it with all types of clauses in charters. I see it a lot in kind of joint venture agreements, things like that. There's already talk about standardized clauses, how you deal with the risk of XE and CII. As soon as COVID happened, there was a big rush towards, let's have a standard COVID clause. I don't think we've got a standard COVID clause, but in the back of people's mind, let's go somewhere standard. Now, if you lay that across the concept of that broad range of technologies that I started with, you kind of go, well, hang on, is there a standard? And how do you deal? And the answer is no. I mean, in my opinion, the answer is no. There isn't a standard. So you need to approach things on a case-by-case basis. You can't apply, and we saw this with scrubbers, you can't apply the concept of a shipbuilding contract installment process for payments to a scrubber, because if you're doing a turnkey contract, installment 4 or 5 is when you install the scrubber on the ship. So how do you finance that? Okay. And then secondly, what happens if the buyer doesn't pay the final installment? So, you know, contractually, you need bespoke contracts for bespoke technologies. But I think from a disputes point of view, that would probably raise a risk of ensuring that you've got the proper advisors to get the right contracts at the time, but also there is a raised risk of there not having that standardization. Therefore, it's a lot harder to be determinative of where a litigation claim might fall out.
Yeah.
Where would you stand? I'd be interested to hear. Is it better to try and keep as much to the standard, as much as the known shipping kind of wording as possible, or should we really be looking at kind of trying to be very bespoke and very particular when we're looking at very new technologies? Or is it a mixture of the two?
Well, I think it's a mixture of the two. I think you're right. And what you described is actually quite interesting, because we see, if we talk about technological innovations within shipping, and we understand that those innovations are iterative, the legal response to that is iterative as well, just in exactly the same way. So if we have a new technology that's giving us some form of new operations, we need to say, when we're drafting our contracts, whether it's a sale contract, a joint venture, or whatever, we need to stop and think, well, what are the new operational or contractual risks that are presented by this new technology? Do we have speed type or performance type issues that we need to provide for and allocate risk for between the parties? Because if you can discuss that with your counterparty ahead of time, look, there's a bit of risk here, shall we allocate that risk in this way, in a bespoke way usually, because there won't be anything standard to start off with, then you're operating on a level playing field of, well, we know where we are, don't we? But of course, then what happens into deployment is that the deployment, the reality of deployment tells us the real world story of where risk is falling. And that feeds back to us about, well, how good is our contract for managing this situation? And we see it with scrubbers. We've seen it with the COVID clause. Come back to the lawyers. The lawyers will take that real world feedback about what's happening, and we'll push that into our clauses to cover it. And slowly we develop more standardized clauses. The standard emerges from the situation. But there's one key thing here, which is essential for that to happen efficiently and swiftly. And that's a really close relationship between our operators and our legal teams. And working with legal teams that truly understand the shipping business, so you can have a proper conversation with them. How's that project going? Where are the risks happening? Have you had any problems? Right, feed that into the drafting that we're doing. So close relationships with advisors, specialist advisors, I think is the key on the front line of this.
Yeah, and in the practical sense, close relationships with the technical R&D staff. If you're acquiring, then someone that knows the technology you're acquiring. If you're developing, making sure you hire the right people to really understand the risks as it pertains to shipping.
Actually, I was going to come on to that, hiring the right people, because we also have to think about the human risk, don't we, when we're adopting some of these new technologies and thinking about some of the alternative fuels that we're that are being developed. There's a human risk there too, isn't there, Martin?
Absolutely. So Mike and Dan have covered that from a sort of a technical and a legal perspective, and about the collaborative part of that. You need to also think about the human aspects of this, the welfare. My concern is that while we're doing this, we're not also thinking about safety and the welfare of the crew on board the ships and how those ships are going to be operated, because that's an equal risk. And I think with an industry that's facing, say, challenges recruiting people into the industry, we need to be thinking about the human dimension of this as well, and making sure that that those technologies are ready to be adopted on board. If we look at the example of LNG, it took some time to get all of the safety, procedural items and the acceptance of ports and terminals and other stakeholders who need to come along in that journey, which is what I mean about a joined up approach. I think you need to connect all of these things to make sure, because that's the only way you can truly mitigate your risk. If you're not thinking across all of these dimensions, you're going to be caught out somewhere.
Yeah, that's got to be right. If your people aren't working, if it's not working for your people, your project is going to be doomed. It will break down.
Perhaps we can spare a thought for how new technologies are going to be financed. That's the big question, who will pay? Obviously in our line of work, acting for particularly banks, and there are a few in the room today represented, we are seeing some banks willing to explore the finance of newer tech through the use of newer documentation, such as the green loan or the sustainability linked loans that we're seeing in the press. And I think our survey certainly did demonstrate that there are a lot of banks really focusing on sustainability when it comes to lending criteria. And of course, we've had a very big uptick in the number of signatories to the Poseidon Principles as well. However, the survey did highlight that traditional bank finance has perhaps a limited appetite for funding clean technology upgrades, for example. And they perhaps would rather others finance the upgrades than they did. And of course, we've seen a little bit about practical challenges, as you mentioned, and how that plays out with scrubbers. And of course, if loan to value covenants allow, you might find the easiest solution is to upsize your existing vessel facility, perhaps, because otherwise the alternative was certainly from a structural perspective throwing up a lot of challenges when it comes to security and whether you can add the scrubber. Is it integrated sufficiently that it has to form part of the existing mortgage and security package on the ship, or whether you can secure it separately? Clearly, bank finance is not available to all. So perhaps I could ask what we're seeing in terms of how these technological upgrades or investments are being financed. What tools are ship owners using? Perhaps I could start with Dan. Yeah,
I mean, I think there's different things we could talk about. There is, efficiency hardware. There is R&D. Who's going to fund the R&D for new technologies? There's a whole range of things. Who's going to fund the infrastructure to allow for worldwide fuel bunkering? Name one of the fuels. Methanol, ammonia, hydrogen, etc., etc. To start with the hardware upgrades, because you mentioned it. The usual way. Taking a long-term charter scenario, the usual way that risk would fall is to say, well, look, is it legally mandated? Is it class mandated? If no, well, that the owner pays for that. And can the owner get the financing? Well, as you said, the banks are less likely to do it. So will the owner self-finance it? Does that fit well with their charter rate? Are they going to make money off that? And that fundamentally, from an economic perspective, was the choice about whether to get scrubbers or not. And you're going to see that on other ships. I mean, you're seeing more and more new building ships being dual fueled, fitting propulsion efficiency technology. So quite clearly in that scenario, the owners are bearing the initial risk, but on the understanding that it's actually going to, or the cost, on the understanding that it's ultimately going to pay off for them in the long term, and the banks are willing to fund those type of ships. So it's retrofit is one thing. Maybe the money has to come from the owners unless they can agree with the charterers that it's going to be good for all. R&D, that other end of the spectrum, and I know there's a lot in the middle, I think it's going to come, and we're already seeing this, I think it's going to be coming from the larger ship owners. I think they are the people that are the best placed to fund it, They're the best place to test the new equipment, the new technology, the new software, the new data. I'm yet to see in my practice a lot of money coming from private equity to fund that type of investment. You may see it from the more VC Series A type investors.
More as it normalises as well, perhaps. But,
possibly, but I worry that the language those type of investors speak is such a distance away from the language that ship owners speak that it might not be a good marriage. You know, we saw it kind of 10, 15 years ago when private equity started to get heavily into shipping. And there was a bit of a, you know, not a rocky start to the marriage, but an adjustment period.
Learning curves.
Yeah, where they had to learn
sides.
how each other speaks. You know, the private equity went, okay, well, we've got an investment horizon of 5 years. We want to get out. And the ship owner going, well, hang on. What happens if the rates at that point are terrible? What happens if the steel price has gone through the floor? I can't sell on the ship or older ships. So I'm skeptical whether the traditional tech investors are really going to be the ones to fill that gap. I personally think it's the larger ship owners, and I think we're already seeing it.
Martin, what are your thoughts on this? It's a big, interesting conundrum, isn't it?
I think this just demonstrates the need to think about this across, you know, more than one dimension, because if you don't, I think you're going to be caught out. I think that's one of the main messages. I think obviously also the equipment suppliers are going to come into this.
Sure.
And are going to fund a lot of this. But I think there's another opportunity here in terms of digitalization and data as an enabler to help this journey, right? So how do you incentivize that? If you can measure how much you're saving and you can do something that's performance-based, then the cargo interests and charterers are far more likely to come to the table. I think what they're reluctant to do is to do it off the back of a promise. And I think the same for people that are financing ships, right? They're financing cash flow. They're not financing technology risk. So if you get a system whereby you can track and actually account for or measure the delta through the investment, I think that's a really good way forward, because then everyone can see what is coming out of that and people can participate in it. So the charterers can say, well, I can actually see that I'm getting something back, so therefore I'm willing to take more of the share of the risk, whether that's in a longer term charter or even perhaps funding demonstrator projects, as we've seen. So we've seen some of the large charterers get into demonstrator project, which is really, really good, because I think we don't solve this from a single stakeholder position. The owners can't solve it and the charterers can't solve it alone either. So, and only when you come together and actually use technology, including data, information as an enabler to measure and track that saving, that's when you really begin to incentivize things to move. And I think that those people that aren't thinking about this are going to find themselves in an increasingly challenging position as information flow becomes, you know, as it speeds up and more information and more benchmarking is made available.
I mean, that's the word I was going to mention. It's benchmarking, because that comes with data gathering, but benchmarking is very important. It's very important on the finance side as well, isn't it? To look at, you know, where if you're looking at a fleet and looking at those better performers and those that perhaps are, you know, more profitable versus others either within a fleet or within a certain, within a certain vessel class. So I think that I mean, I agree with you that there does need to be quite a bit of data collection in order to then determine what the best technology is, and that might make it more attractive to finance as well, because it's easier to see what its potential cost savings or profitability projections are. I think that's a good point.
Yeah, so the work I'm doing in Lookout, a lot of it's about trying to help the owner of a fleet, whether that's the ship owner or a bank, understand where they stand. You know, where do they stand with that particular fleet today, and then understanding beyond the regulatory side, which is coming anyway, and you have to address in one form or another. So you have to do something. I think it's clear now that EEXI and CII, is fundamentally different from all the regulations that came before it. CII in particular, because it's an incremental thing. It's not a one and done. And I don't think the industry necessarily has understood this enough. But I think once you've understood where you are on that journey, then you can start to work out what the delta is. You can work out what is the tradability of your ship going to be from a regulatory perspective, but also from a market perspective. What does that look like in 2023, 2026, and 2030? Then you can start to make a decision on where you want to invest, which ships you want to change, maybe ships you'd like to sell. what technologies are available, and you can then really come down to understanding, your different options, and you can prepare a business case, which I think will then be easier to fund and finance, because you've then come to a lender and you said, well, I've looked at my whole fleet, I've identified these 5 ships. And actually, because of these 5 ships, we've looked at these 3 options, and the best option is newest duck for these ships, and this is what we expect to get out of it. And this is how we're going to measure it. Then I think you're having a different conversation.
Yeah, I mean, you make it sound so easy, Martin. I do hope we get there with that. That's
I just want to pick up on one thing Martin said. Martin was talking about looking at this holistically, and all the different stakeholders, whether it's owners, charterers, or financiers. I think that's absolutely right, isn't it? Because it's only going to be a holistic solution that actually gets through and leads us to the type of change we're talking about. And so if we're a ship owner, charterer, or financier, we also need to remember the risks that are out there for those people that will be manufacturing or supplying this change. If we're talking about hardware change of any type, that basically means either an engineering company, a shipbuilder, or an engine manufacturer. And unfortunately, business being business, if you say to a builder, can you do this new design? Generally, they'll say, yeah. and history tells us that sometimes they're wrong, or sometimes it's not as simple as that. And of course, what happens when we're negotiating our contracts often is we'll say, well, look, you take this design risk, shipbuilder. And you'll say, sure, okay, no problem. Our engineers are great. We'll sort that out. And the fact that you've allocated that risk to that shipyard might look good on paper, but what if they then don't deliver? Well, it's all your fault and you owe me a lot of damages. Well,
and it also becomes more red-lined when you're starting to talk about software IP data.
Absolutely.
Because at least in those hardware scenarios, ship owners have a working knowledge of how to deal with a shipyard, with how to deal with a hardware manufacturer.
Absolutely.
But now they're having to grapple with, well, how do we work with a software provider? How do we negotiate a software maintenance agreement? How do we deal with bugs?
Or even IP rights and things like that. It's a different language, isn't it?
Yeah, and I think, as a lawyer, we all sometimes can be tagged with being doom and gloom, but I don't think it needs to be doom and gloom. I just think it needs a little bit of foresight of knowing how are you going to structure the way you're acquiring or developing this technology, and do you have the right risks covered off? And it can be as simple as, in some of the contracts that I'm seeing, which have been somewhat negotiated and then come to my desk, I kind of say, well, okay, well, you're coming up with a very new idea here. It may not be patentable, it might not be to that level, but who's owning the IP at the end of this? Oh, that's a good question. And that can be quite an important part of a deal, which really, for traditional ship owners, when they're talking about IP, they're basically saying, well, ship owner, you retain the IP, or manufacturer, you retain the IP to that piece of equipment. Whereas maybe if you're spending the money to develop a piece of software or a piece of equipment, maybe the right sharing of that ownership should come back to the ship owner, or maybe be shared and monetized through a different vehicle. So
we found with our survey that a surprising number of ship owners, at least, appear very receptive to the idea of joint ventures and collaboration. And that's not just necessarily horizontal with other ship owners in order to help perhaps increase economies of scale so that it makes change a little bit more affordable for them, but also some collaborations we've seen in the press, at least, with renewable energy companies themselves, which I think is an interesting development. Did you have any observations about that? I mean, are you seeing particularly a heightened number of joint ventures and collaboration with perhaps less typical partnerships being formed?
Yeah, I mean, I think that goes back to what I was saying earlier, that we're starting to see it's the major ship owners that and the charterers to a certain extent leading the way. I mean, we've
talked about the sort of the risk profile there when you've got perhaps a larger fleet and you're sort of targeting maybe 4 or 5 as methanol carriers. They can afford perhaps to shoulder that risk eat more easily than, of course, the smaller.
The very well rehearsed example in the press at the moment is all the work that Maersk is doing with Maersk's growth, but also in the vertical chain of methanol. You know, they've just placed some orders for dual fuel ships. They've got production facility in Denmark, and I just saw recently they've invested into a joint venture for multiple type of methanol production joint venture, because they're going to, if they really want to meet those carbon targets, they're going to need to find a steady producer of green methanol as opposed to not green methanol. So you're seeing there, the vertical integration, which is probably needed. You've seen the similar thing from MOL. I think we're going to see that expand. I just think that the joint ventures are going to come from the bigger ship owners with the innovators of the world, and generally. Whether that is a formal joint venture, like what Maersk Growth are trying to do, or through partnerships, because we see other, partnerships with other efficiency technologies as well, as opposed to fuel technologies. And those are generally, as reading between the lines, they seem to me to be generally more unincorporated partnerships where the ship owners will be testing out the technology, and perhaps being able to have kind of more their exclusive first mover right on installation of that technology if it works out well. So there's very different structures there. But
I suppose the vertical point is also a good point to just acknowledge that type of vertical integration and the type of technological development that changes what cargoes are moving where is a big part of the risk opportunity. The most obvious one that we might think of is change in fuel. So if over a period of 50 years we migrate away from oil towards other fuels or another fuel, then the very cargoes that these ships are going to be carrying will be different. People who are currently carrying oil may be carrying less oil, and they're going to have to carry something else. So it's interesting. The very change we're talking about will change the very business that this industry is serving. But that's a big part of what represents the opportunity, as we've seen with Maersk doing and putting in the infrastructure locally in Denmark for production of methanol that's going to need to be shipped places. I have no doubt that Maersk will be carrying some of that.
Martin and I, we were talking about this over coffee this morning, weren't we? And this idea of actually the ship owners providing the ship owners working with their cargo colleagues, and the cargo colleagues will provide the fuel. But scalability, Martin, what are your thoughts on how all of this can be upscaled, and what challenges do we have to face there?
Well, I think, what the conversation that we're having here demonstrates is that there are a number of risks, but what we need to be a little bit careful of is that doesn't lead to inertia, because there are things that you can do. And I applaud all of these projects because they're actually demonstrating that these things are technically possible. They're getting training, all these things together. But I don't think we should lose sight of whether these are scalable or not. And I think the reality is today they aren't. So there's a journey from where we are today. There's still going to be conventional fuel around for a while, but how do we manage that journey in a smooth way such that actually at the end of the day, what we're doing is really the right thing for people and the planet? Because making a green fuel today isn't particularly environmentally friendly, but it will become that over time. But I think the key thing is how do you overcome that inertia and get everyone moving? And I think the way you do that is to get good partnerships of really sort of strong people that can help you execute these things in a more risk-free way with a higher degree of confidence. Because then you can start to move and you can start to position yourself rather than be positioned sometime in the future by some sort of invisible force. Talking to a ship owner the other day, he's in container shipping, feeder container shipping. You would think he would be, laughing today with the freight rates the way they are. But actually, from 1 week to the next, he was fine 1 week. The next week, the charterer said he wasn't going to take his ships anymore. So I think, there are all of these things that are happening that are maybe outside of on the periphery that suddenly burst in, and you just from one day to the next, you can just get that customer suddenly says no. that ship is not efficient enough, I'm not going to take that ship on charter. Then what do you do? Because then you haven't positioned yourself, you haven't gone to dry dock, you haven't executed these things that could put you in that position. So I see this as, you know, in terms of the positives and the pull factors, is this is an excellent way to hedge your risk and take a position in which you can control this better.
I mean, one thing we haven't really talked too much about is regulation and the role of the regulators. Obviously, we've got quite a lot of potential regulation coming in, and obviously we've got the CII and the ETS as well being introduced around 2023, so they say. So, you know, what are your thoughts? Perhaps I could start with you, Martin, on the role of regulators and whether that's, you know, do you see that their role is essential really in helping to drive this march towards a decarbonised future, and also perhaps any thoughts about how it can be, how regulation can be enforced, you know, or is it an incentive approach we should be looking at?
I think it's absolutely essential that the regulators are involved. And I think I would take that one level further. Also, I think that politicians understand shipping and the shipping industry a little better, so that what they're promulgating and what they're doing is actually bringing us forward. So, and
I suppose also not looking at it in isolation, because their role would also have to be to develop infrastructure and the renewable energy source, you know, have even a more holistic approach to the global problem, perhaps.
I think that's the tough part for regulators, is they happen to sit in a single country, or politicians. So they're in a single country with a single constituency, and shipping doesn't work like that. So I think I do have some appreciation for the challenges that they face. I mean, at the moment, you could say that there's a lot of regulation out there that isn't enforced. So do we need more regulation? And I think the answer is yes, but obviously I think you need regulation that is global, preferably for the shipping industry, unless it's, you know, for regional or cabotage trade. But I think that unless you have sort of a certain degree of regulation, you don't get things moving. So I think we need the carrot and the stick. And I think the carrot here is really sort of positioning yourself so that you don't find that you have assets that are devalued or stranded. And I think you need to be thinking about this in terms of optionality, so you don't bet the farm on one option or another. So I think regulation plays a really key, important role. And, you know, when the EU ETS comes in, that's really, I think, a game changer, because then you're talking about a regulation directed specifically at carbon.
It's interesting from our sustainability report. I think that was, you know, obviously identified as a bit of a driver for ship owners and charterers and what have you. But what also came out of the report was they're saying pretty broadly that governments need to kind of step in and incentivize this and help out with the bill, really. But it goes back to exactly what...
think about subsidies, you know, and the offshore wind, you know, it did benefit from subsidies, which are obviously less used now.
Yeah, the problem is exactly what Martin just said, though, is that shipping is a global business. So, you know, which government's stepping in? Are we expecting, you know, offshore wind? Okay, great, that's fantastic, because... And
that was a domestic business,
exactly, yeah. So, you know, which government is going to subsidise this? Is everyone going to agree? That doesn't seem to happen very quickly, if at all. So it's a bit of a difficult one to ask governments, another very broad term like technology, to step in. You might get some local kind of incentives for cabotage trade. You might get a very, I would call them Singapore-like incentives, you know, come and run your business from here, which are great, but it's a big bill. I think if I'm not wrong, someone can tell me if I'm wrong, $60 billion per year to fund, you know, I think there was in DNV's recent report, which is very good, to fund the technology and the investment needed to meet the decarbonisation targets. That's a lot of money. It's got to come from somewhere.
Yes.
Any
thoughts, Mike?
What I would observe is that timing is key with regulation. Regulation before there is the appropriate technology around which a certain critical mass of consensus has formed is pointless, because it'll just backfire, won't be implemented, won't be enforced, and it just becomes a dud. It becomes a hurdle for shipping. So it's iterative. It's one small piece of regulation at a time, and you build it over a long period. And I suspect the technology around the types of things we're talking about at the moment is just not developed enough yet for regulators to intervene.
Well, your point's quite a pertinent one, because I thought perhaps with 10 minutes to spare, we could move on to questions. And we have had a couple of questions, well, actually some very good questions that have come to us from the online viewers or attendees. And one is linked to what you just said, Mike, about regulation. And once we've decided what route we're going to go down, we do have a question saying that Daniel mentioned different low emissions fuels like methanol, hydrogen, ammonia. Is the industry better putting all eggs in one basket in development of alternative fuels, or casting a wider net? And this is something, diversification is something certainly, Martin, you and I talked about earlier.
Yeah. I think it's important, we mustn't forget the underlying business behind this, right? It needs to be profitable, and if you can make it profitable, then you get incentives in line, you get people to act, and you actually get real progress. So I think that in my mind, we're going to see a range of fuels adapted based on maybe what the cargo interests provide, or the geography or the trade of that ship. In my mind, I think if you went for a single fuel, and this comes up in every conference, what fuel is it going to be? So if everyone went to methanol, I would say the problem is going to be that methanol is going to be $3,000 a ton before you blink, because everyone needs it. So I think in my mind, if we're going to have an orderly transition, you need multiple fuels that you can play on for different trades, and you can work out where you can decarbonize with the biggest impact. Excuse me, and put your go there. I think it should be more outcomes based. Take a certain trade or a certain industry. If you take container shipping between China and Europe, right? Container ships are burning a huge amount of fuel every day. 160, 180 tons a day. So if you can find, and this is exactly what Maersk are doing, if you can find a way to decarbonize that, then you're having an impact, which is meaningful. But I do think we're into a multi-fuel future, and I think that's right, because otherwise you're going to dislocate and create a lot of chaos in the transition. And when it comes to who pays for it, well, nobody's going to want to pay for it. So you need to manage that.
You need to look at it through two dimensions. On the single owner dimension, few owners have the cash or appetite for risk that would say, let's go for multiple different fuels right now, all of us. Of course, they don't. Not even the Maersks of this world really are doing that. So what happens is, on an individual basis, ship owners take a view as to which alternative fuel or which option they want to try out. And then if you step back and look at the global shipping fleet, you'll look at the performance of those different tryouts and the optimum alternatives for any given market, time or place emerge. So this is a process, not a one-time only choice.
Yes, I mean, we found with scrubbers, not everyone made the same decision when low sulfur regulations came in. So I mean, I think you're right that we'll be looking at a variety of fuels and a variety of technologies. But I suspect that there will be front runners that emerge from that. But
I think you do need to build the optionality into it, because the one thing for sure is you're going to be unable to predict the future. So if you establish optionality and you create these choices to go down different pathways, I think that's the best we can do. Right now as an industry. The important thing though is to get started.
One size doesn't fit all, so I agree with you, Martin. Are there any questions in the room at all? Anyone want to pose a question to the panel? Yes, we have a question here. We're just bringing the mic over. Could you just let us know your name and then answer the question?
Yes, it's Dan Vivian from the UK Ship Register. Thank you to the panel. Very interesting. One area that is a big debate internally within the MCA is the development of infrastructure and how that's going to be supported. Because Martin, you talk about optionality and the various options. Not every port is going to be able to invest in every technology. How do you see that playing out? And I've got a second question as well, if I may,
yes.
Just to ask each of the panel what their hopes and expectations are for COP26.
Okay, so taking the first one, I think this is why I was saying I think it needs to be trade specific. So if the customers or the industry being served by that port are in one sector or another, of course, it becomes an slightly easier choice. So I think you cannot. What LNG as fuel taught us was that obviously getting the alternative fuels into a port is by no means simple. You know, in terms of the port infrastructure, bunkering, you know, the ships can't come out of their trade just to bunker. So I think it has to be done in a trade corridor or trade specific way. And you probably will have to deal with tramp shipping in a slightly different way as well. And I think that's the only way to me that you could do that.
Mm.
To your second question, I mean, I hope for more alignment between IMO and the delegates at COP26. I think there's a little bit of dissonance there between what countries are bringing to each of those bodies, really, and I hope it is, you know, an affirmation of what's happening. I think shipping, as we started off saying, is a conservative industry, but we're actually seeing things happen. You know, this is not just talk. You know, things are actually happening. So if as to the other point I was making about governments giving support, you know, if the delegates who are going to the IMO are more aligned with the governments who are at COP26, I think then that presents a better a narrative or a bit more certainty to the shipping industry, to allow ship owners, charterers, other stakeholders to be a bit more confident in pushing their developments forward. So that's what I hope from COP26. Yeah.
Yeah, I share Dan's views on COP26. More alignment is the number one thing that we need to see. With regard to your infrastructure point, I think the reality is that most of the time, ports will be responding to the demands of a particular customer who will say, we have this project, but we need to be able to do X. You can't support that at the moment. What are we going to do about it? I dare say some of the time, certainly less of the time, ports may be able to spot their own opportunity. We see that there's this particular potential for traffic of X commodity or X type of freight coming through, but we need that infrastructure to do it. So I think it will be, as Martin was saying, project by project, customer by customer to start off with until a certain momentum builds up, and then the thing speaks for itself.
I think on COP26, I think it's a fantastic platform to get this on the agenda and get it moving. My hope is that the delegates at COP26 actually take the time to understand the shipping industry a bit better. Yeah. That would be fantastic, because then I think they might understand a little bit better what the real opportunities are. So there are things you can do and things you can implement, but you need to understand them in the context of not a single country, for instance, as the example we mentioned before. So my wish is for the delegates at COP26, if they could have some sort of magic wand over them and understand the shipping industry, I think that would be fantastic.
So that's a birthday wish. That's
a big ask.
There you go. Think big.
Yes. Oh, I know. Well, for my small contribution, I think my expectations differ slightly as a mother than as a finance lawyer. You know, I have a burning hope that, you know, there are some real sort of concrete targets set at COP26, and that, as you say, there's alignment and everyone signs up to them. I suppose, I mean, I have that hope as a finance lawyer, but perhaps I don't have that expectation, because I'm slightly pessimistic about, you know, how all the attendees will embrace, you know, the problem and the solutions that we need to find to fix them. So perhaps I'm a little more pessimistic as a finance lawyer about, you know, the outcomes of the discussions there in October. I think it's October, than than I'm than hopeful as a mother, I suppose. But that's that. Do we have any more questions in the room? Yes, at the back there. Please let us have your name, and then
Yes.
you can ask a question.
Antonis Alexandropoulos from Deutsche Bank. Thank you very much for the presentation. One question regarding the emissions targets from the IMO and the reduction by 2050. Is this supposed to be a linear reduction, like 2% every year? And how is this going to be monitored? So ship companies have to, they have to submit certificates, but how, and it's going to be reviewed in 2023 as far as I know, but is this supposed to be a linear reduction?
Yes, so it starts out with sort of 2%, and then that reduction 2% on averages. So it's worked on the average consumption, on a year by ship type. So it starts out with 2%, and it starts to ratchet up to, I think, 4 and 6. But so towards the sort of outer end of that, it starts to increase. What happens then is the ship is ranked from A to E, and if you D or E, you have 2 years to do something about complying with the A, becoming A, B, or C. I believe what's going to happen is the freight interest, and because of transparency and benchmarking and information that will be available everywhere, will effectively require that the ships are on the higher end of that spectrum. So I think you need to understand your fleet, your portfolio. You need to understand the options in terms of what you can do to ensure that it's positioned correctly, because I think that this is going to affect the residual value of ships.
Well, thank you. Sorry. Thanks. Thank you, Martin. I think looking at the time, we've had our hour. So I'd like to thank London International Shipping Week for the opportunity to have this great panel debate. There are some really wonderful events going on during the week in London. And I know some of my colleagues, I know Lindsey certainly is moderating a panel tomorrow, I believe. So do go to the events diary and check them out. We can tell there's some very steep challenges ahead for the industry, and I think I take comfort from the fact that there's a lot of awareness of the problem too, which is a good thing. So I think that with all the expertise we have in London, in the shipping world and in the UK generally, we should hopefully all be able to apply our minds to finding solutions to these challenges. And I know certainly at Watson Farley we continue to help our clients with their future plans that involve, let's hope, a decarbonised future. So thank you very much for joining us, and thank you to everyone online who have dialed in, and to everyone in the room.
And I'd like to thank you, Watson Farley, for hosting and for inviting me.
No, thank you very much, Martin. Thank you.
Thanks very much.